Thank you. I was eager to get on there. So, hello to everyone online as well, tuning in. It's so good to have you here. It's so good to have you all in the room. The novelty of this still has not been lost on me. So, Portraits of Christ. So when I first heard about this series, I initially was a little bit of a panic. I thought, oh my goodness, what am I going to talk about? Because I'm not necessarily like a complete Philistine when it comes to the arts. I got an A star in art GCSE, humble brag. But no way do I have the kind of knowledge of the Renaissance that Pastor Tom does. I'm more of a kind of modern art kind of person. So I was a little bit panicked initially of what on earth, what portrait am I going to talk about? But then the punk in me spoke up and was like, why don't you talk about tattoo, a portrait of Jesus in tattoo form, because people get that a lot, right? And it's still, I know there might be a little bit of division amongst the listeners today about whether that is truly art, but I would definitely advocate that tattoo is an incredible art form. So I'm going to be talking to you this morning about the portrait of Christ in tattoo form, ink in skin. And then I think the punk in me got a little bit carried away because I started thinking oh my goodness, how cool would it be? How controversial would it be if I got a portrait of Jesus tattooed on me in the service while I spoke? How mental would that be? And then I remembered, one, Helena, you're pregnant, you're not allowed to get a tattoo. And two, I think it is actually illegal to get a tattoo outside of a registered tattoo studio. So I know, fun police strike again. Yeah. Anyway, moving on to Portraits of Christ in tattoo form. So it's thought that sailors would often get a tattoo of Jesus on their back. And because if they were to face maybe a lashing at sea, that when they were getting lashed, the person who was lashing them would see the portrait of Jesus, of the Savior, and maybe go easy on them. Interesting, yeah? Other times, sailors have got tattoos of Christ because they wanted to bring kind of good fortune to themselves. They hoped that it would bring protection from storms or drowning at sea, because you hear Jesus is pretty good in a storm, if you know about that story. But it was in reading up about tattoos of Jesus and the significance of them that I kind of ended up down this rabbit hole of the history of tattoos in general, and the significance of them in different cultures, in different time periods, all around the world. And it's fascinating. For example, in ancient Egypt, tattoos served as religious and protective symbols on the wearer. In ancient Rome, it was a way of branding shame onto people, onto criminals. And apparently doctors at the time were often asked to tattoo criminals with their medical equipment. I'm not sure how I feel about that as a doctor. That's quite an interesting situation to be put in. But then in Samoan culture, you have this 3,000-year-old tradition called tatau, which is where young people are tattooed as they're kind of coming of age. It's part of their transition into adulthood, and it's actually this really it's a mark of respect and a significance that they're kind of transitioning into a respected member of society, and so it's a really positive thing. So in so many different places, tattoos have long been held in a positive light, but I think in the West it's really interesting to see how our view of tattoos has changed, and I think we've had the biggest shift in opinion of tattoos over time, because there were something that once we branded criminals with. Then they became very popular amongst sailors, as I mentioned, in sort of 19th, 20th century, which kind of led them to be, held in not a good light, because sailors often were in ports and getting all their tattoos in a port, which was often associated with criminals and prostitutes. Gangs were often in that kind of port area. So you could see why there's a lot of negative connotations with tattoos and tattooed people. But since really the 70s, tattoos have kind of grown in popularity in the masses and become more widely socially acceptable, with the help from celebrities and creatives. But there has been this massive shift to nowadays, rather than it being a mark of kind of deviance, it's a way of expressing yourself. It's now fashionable, and many different subcultures have different styles, and kind of art, the styles of tattoo is applicable to different subcultures and different people. Much to my parents' disappointment, it is fashionable and something that I personally like doing. But so tattoos in the West nowadays are a way of expressing yourself, I think, in a positive way. They can mark creativity. They can be an expression of your identity or even belonging to a certain subculture or people group. And I think ultimately nowadays, I think tattooing has become a symbol of freedom for so many. Free to mark yourself permanently, whether that's ill-advised or not. And I think there's this shift in symbolism of tattoos in history. It's really, really interesting. Like, how can a tattoo maybe once be a symbol of slavery or oppression or marginalization now become a symbol of creativity, of personal expression, and ultimately freedom? Like, because it's an interesting question in general, right? Like, how can something that once is a symbol of slavery or oppression, of limitation, restriction, become the very thing that actually signifies people's freedom? Like, and it got me thinking even more about this concept in general in life. Like, how can the thing that holds us back, that limits us, that oppresses us, or that enslaves us, turn into the thing of freedom? Maybe it helps to define what freedom actually is. So the dictionary definition of freedom is the power to act, speak, or think as one wants, or to change without constraint. And I think, like, in life, I would say that freedom is to be rid of the things that stop us from achieving our potential. It's to be without those constraints to help us change. So how can we, or can we indeed, take the thing that limits us and turn it into our freedom? Because, like, we hear about this kind of thing happening in some people's lives, right? Like highly successful people people who have, like, achieved so much in life. You hear about them saying that actually it was when they encountered something that limited them, it's something that held them back, that actually was the key to their success. You know, you hear people say, oh, if this hadn't happened to me, then I wouldn't be the person I am today. For example, Phil Temple says that, you know, if he hadn't broken his leg, which he talks about not that often, if he hadn't broke his leg, actually, it means that he would not be as fit and as active as he is right now. Which sounds mad, right? Like, breaking your leg is like the opposite to going out for a run every day, right? But actually, it was the thing that held him back, that oppressed him for a time, that was the key to his freedom in the area of health and fitness. On a slightly more kind of elite fitness level, sorry, Phil, there's this guy called Matt Fraser, who most of you won't have heard of, but he's probably the most famous name in the, wait for it, CrossFit world. Hey, because he is the most dominant male athlete of all time in the CrossFit world. Like, he has won 5 straight consecutive CrossFit games. He is just the most successful person, not just now in CrossFit, but in life as well. He's done extremely well since his retirement, but if he was on the competition floor, he was going to win. But he has this little phrase that defines him, and he says it's broken to best. And the reason he says that is because when he was a lot younger, when he was a teenager, he was set to become an Olympic weightlifter. And like, he was, you know, on track at all the kind of like Olympic training centers or whatever, and he was going to compete in the Olympics. That was his goal, and he was really good at it. But then he broke his back in 2 places. Hopes of ever competing in the Olympics completely dashed. But it was this very injury that meant he found CrossFit. And actually, once he recovered from that, he then became far more successful than he ever would have done had he not had that injury and had it not happened. And it happens outside of sport as well. Apparently, Einstein didn't speak until he was 4 years old, and his teachers didn't really think he would amount to much. But he's literally the person you think of, like, if you think of who's one of the most intelligent people ever, Einstein. Yeah. Bill Gates, you know, one of the most successful businessmen in the world, Microsoft, apparently his first product and company failed. No one wanted to buy it. You know, one of the people that some of you may know from hearing his story firsthand is the story of Jeff Letts. He's a great friend of our church. He's been here a number of times speaking on this platform and doing seminars and things, but his story is incredible because When he was a young child, his dad, because of extreme financial difficulty, committed suicide. And then 2 years later, his mum died. So he was orphaned on the streets of Chicago at the age of 7. Despite all of that, he became a millionaire by the age of 31. Like, that's mad. But he, since then, has dedicated his life to helping people find financial security and financial freedom. And it's because of his history that he's then able to do what he is doing today. He says he didn't want his history to become his destiny, but if he had not been through that adversity, he would not be achieving what he is achieving and helping so many people today. So it does happen. Adversity, major limitations, marginalization, oppression can actually be the very thing that leads to success for people. The thing that was once a symbol of restriction or limitation becomes a reason for someone's success and therefore their freedom. But is that for all of us? Like, is that something that we can, average Joe, you and I in the room today or watching online, is that something that we can access? Can we have that too? Or is it just for the highly successful 1%, the Bill Gates, the Einsteins of this world? Can we see this in our lives? Or is this just something for famous people? Can we find freedom in our limitations? Can we rid ourselves of these constraints and make progress towards fulfilling our potential? Or is just that something reserved for the elite? Can we shift our challenges or the things that have held us back to become the very thing that gives us success? Can we take our problem and make it our platform for our progress? Can we take the things that limit us and use them to unlock our freedom? That is the question that I want to try and answer today. But if we look at this portrait of Christ, ink in skin, it means freedom in many ways. Freedom to express yourself by getting a tattoo, but ultimately freedom because that is what Christ has bought us. But what does that mean then? If Christ has brought us freedom, how does that play into this overall question about limitations becoming our freedom as well? Like, that's an extra layer of complexity in it. How does this freedom that Christ has given us play into all of this? So let's, I think, look at a verse in the Bible that talks about freedom. And from there, I hope that we can try and answer this question of, can we take the things that limit us and use them to unlock our freedom? And so I want to start there's a verse in Galatians 5:1. Start by reading it in the NIV, and it's going to be on the screen for you all as well. It says, "It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery." And I want to read it in the Passion Translation as well, because I think it adds even more to understanding this verse. And it says, "At last we have freedom, for Christ has set us free. We must always cherish this truth and firmly refuse to go back into the bondage of our past." So, let's break this down to try and answer this existential question. Firstly, Christ has set us free. That's what this verse established. But let's try and understand what that actually means for us. Many of you in the room or tuning in online or on a podcast may know and understand, yes, Christ has bought my freedom, but I am conscious that maybe there are people who are tuning in right now who don't know that or don't understand that. And if that is you today, I'm so glad you're here or listening. It's amazing. But I think actually as Christians or people that have been around church or Christianity for a long time, we can maybe become quite flippant about what that actually means. So I thought, let's recap the whole of the theology of salvation really quickly right now for you. So, to establish, before Jesus, sin separated, sin as in all the things that we have done wrong, ever will do wrong, all the things that make us imperfect, that make us fall short of perfection. It separated man from a perfect God. So before Jesus, people had to try and make themselves in better standing with God, to try and account for all this bad stuff that separated from them and God. They had to try and make themselves right themselves through like ceremonial religious practices and sacrifices. But then Jesus came to earth, God in human form. He dies on a cross, and in doing so takes on all our sin. He becomes the ultimate sacrifice, takes on all our sin, anything that we ever have done wrong, ever will do wrong for all of time, for all people, takes it on himself, dies, and then defeats death, burying our sin and shame, rises again to new life, coming back and eventually ascends into heaven, therefore kind of nullifying and getting rid of our sin and anything that gets in the way of a relationship, a direct relationship with man and God. So that's the nuts and bolts of salvation, of this freedom that we have. And I'm conscious that I've kind of whisked through that, and there's, you can go on courses and people have studied this for a long, long time. And so if you are new to this or relatively new to this, I really want to encourage you to kind of to read up more about it yourself, ask more questions. And we would, as a church, we would love to help you with that. And I think probably the easiest way to be able to do that and to help direct you to some resources and support you through that is head to the website, proclaimers.com/connect, as we mentioned before. Give us some details if you haven't done already, and just write, there's a little message box you can write, I want to know more about this. Please do that, because I would love to be able to go into more depth with it today, but I don't have time. And actually, I do have one quick recommendation for everyone, regardless of where you're at on that journey, and it's a book called The Naked Gospel by Andrew Farley. And I think it's essential reading when we talk about freedom and salvation. That Jesus has brought us. It's great if you've never really encountered this before, and also if you've been a Christian for a really long time. It's very thought-provoking, very challenging, so that's my little recommendation there too. Anyway, so what does this mean for all of us in our day-to-day lives now, though? Well, it means that there is nothing that we need to do or say to make ourselves right with God, other than believing that Jesus died for us. That's all we need to do. There's nothing that we can do or say that will change how God feels about us or his love for us. We are now free from the burden that we have to do X, Y, Z in order to ensure that God is happy with us. Jesus has paid for our freedom. But going back to the verse, the context of this verse, as ever, is so important. Because this verse in Galatians is the Apostle Paul writing to the Galatian people to actually address an issue here. So he was addressing an issue of inaccurate teaching that was going about. It was kind of doing the rounds, that it was saying that actually people were teaching that you still need to do all the ceremonial Jewish practices despite Jesus Christ having bought your freedom. He was reiterating to people that actually you're only justified by your faith in Jesus, not by the practices of what they referred to as what we call the law, which was the religious practices of the day. And they had the things that people had to do in order to give them right standing with God. So he was saying to them, you are now free from the bounds of this ceremonial law. And it was because it was a heavy day-to-day burden. It was restrictive and it was life-dominating. Yet, despite knowing this, despite knowing that they were free from having to do that because of what Jesus has done, people were still going back to their old ways under this oppressive law, such as like circumcision, which he goes on to address later on in the passage if you read on. So Paul is encouraging them to stand firm in this freedom and resist the urge to go back to old ways. And I think that's interesting because it implies that there is an easy tendency to do that, right? Like going back to the ways that previously enslaved people or restricted people or limited people was something that was actually tempting to do. He says, don't let yourselves be burdened by slavery of our old ways, because actually it is a choice and it's something that we have control over. And I think Paul is spot on here at addressing a common human flaw. We can be given a fresh start. We can be given freedom from things that restrict us, yet we can be so tempted to continue to live within those restrictions. So I'm going to suggest something controversial as the answer to the original question of, can we take the thing that enslaves us, take the thing that limits us, that holds us back, and turn it into our freedom? And I put it to you this morning that yes, we all can. And the way in which we unlock our freedom is to admit that we're actually holding on to our limitations. The way we unlock our freedom is to admit that we're actually holding on to our limitations. I can feel a lot of you thinking, what? Like, I don't want this. I don't want the things that are holding me back to be there. I'm not holding on to them. But just entertain this notion with me for a minute. It's challenging, but it's good for us to be challenged, right? And I am definitely speaking to myself this morning too. But see, when we're limited by something, when we are in a difficult situation or a difficult season in life, or maybe we've been faced with a lot of challenging things growing up, and it's formed us to have beliefs about ourselves and our capabilities, and we've held on to from a young age, we develop ways of coping within our limitations and within our adversity. We develop strategies to try and improve the situation within this bad situation, to work within the limitations, just to make it that little bit better for ourselves. It might look like things like, if you struggle with anxiety, you avoid the things that trigger your anxiety. Maybe we lower our expectations to prevent disappointment. Maybe we don't take on new challenges as we don't feel like we're not confident that we have the physical or emotional capacity to do it, so we just don't try. Maybe we only ever do things we know we can do comfortably. Maybe we manage our fear or uncertainty by trying to prepare and control for every eventuality. Maybe we change direction when things get tough, meaning that we never actually see something to completion. Maybe we attribute our limitations to an external source, to someone or something else, therefore meaning it kind of stops us from having to do anything about it, and we don't waste any energy trying. Maybe we try and find our value in other things when we doubt our value in ourselves, like our finding value in success or finding value in what other people think of us. Maybe we're holding on to these coping strategies. Maybe we're actually finding comfort in these limitations because they're safe. They are what we know. They're kind of containing, but they're not the best that we can achieve. Maybe it's fear of the unknown that's holding us back. Maybe we're so uncertain about who we are and what life might look like without these limitations, whether they're self or externally inflicted, that actually fear of who we are without them holds us back. Maybe we fear getting better because we don't know what better actually looks like. Maybe our identity is so rooted in these limitations that we don't know who we are without them. You know, these kind of things that limit us, that ultimately hold us back, be it the original limiting factor or maybe our way of coping within our limitations that we've developed, these are constraints. They are stopping us from achieving our potential. They are stopping us from achieving our God-given potential. They are limiting our freedom. And Jesus has promised that each and every one of us can live life to the full, free. He has plans to prosper us, a great purpose for us all in this life. He has destined us for greatness if we step into the freedom that he has purchased for us. You know, nowadays, most of us don't have ceremonial Jewish law to kind of be tempted back into doing like the Galatians, but we all have things that we did do or still do to try and justify ourselves instead of being content in the freedom that Christ brings. The way we unlock our freedom is to admit that we're actually holding on to our limitations. Going back to that verse, it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. Or in the Passion Translation, at last we have freedom, for Christ has set us free. We must cherish this truth and firmly refuse to go back into the bondage of our past. Firmly refuse to go back into the bondage of our past. So, I'm aware that's probably quite full on for a morning, but we do need to identify these limitations in order to leave them behind. It's going to take a period of reflection for each and every one of us to figure out what they actually are. What are we holding on to then let them go? As Paul implies, this is an active process. It's something we need to do intentionally, and we need to constantly address it. Now, that's not easy. It's not pleasant either, necessarily, to try and think about what to challenge ourselves in that area. But it will be worth it if we do. And there's no kind of overnight quick fix or one thing that I can say, just do this and that'll change everything for good. I wish there was. There's no 5-step program that you need to follow in order to step into your freedom and leave your limitations behind. But I've got some questions for us all to reflect on, not right now, but in maybe the weeks to come. Some homework for you all. That makes it sound even more appealing, right? But yes, I've got these questions that I hope will help form your thoughts around this area to figure out what is it that we are holding on to that is holding us back. So we are a church that takes notes, as Sam Cousins always says. So I'm going to put these questions to you, and I really want to encourage you to write these down, whatever thing you've got, whether it's your phone, notebook, whatever, write these down and to be thinking about them in the weeks to come. So question number 1 is, what beliefs do I have about myself that are holding me back? What beliefs do I have about myself that are holding me back? So what kind of framework of presumption are you working within? What is restricting you? Like, what often do you presume that you just can't do? What do you say that you're not good at about yourself? What kind of language are you using about yourself? You know, the kind of the identifying factor I find in these kind of limiting situations is that actually you use very negative language about yourself, like, oh, I can't do this, or I am bad at this, or I don't have enough, time, money, energy, whatever. So what beliefs do I have about myself that are holding me back? Now, question number 1. Question number 2, what decisions am I making as a result of these beliefs? What decisions am I making as a result of these beliefs? Are you restricting what you do as a result? Are you turning down opportunities? Are you living a smaller life as a result of these beliefs? What decision am I making as a result of these beliefs? And then question number 3, what could I do differently to live more freely? What could I do differently to live more freely? Ask yourself, if you didn't have these restrictions on your life, what could or would you do? What could or would you do? Think about what life would look like without these restrictions that maybe you've identified in question number 1. And then think about what would it take in order to get there. Maybe it's a question of trying to problem solve around the restrictions and the limitations that are in place. What could I do differently to live more freely? So, those are the 3 questions for us all to be thinking about going forward. And as the band come up, actually, because I'm almost finished, thought-provoking things for you to go away with today. But like with the history of tattoos, how can we turn the thing that holds us back, that limits us, into our freedom? Well, Jesus Christ has bought our freedom. So we need to actively choose to live in this freedom. We can take our limitations and turn them into our success. But the way we unlock our freedom is to admit that maybe we're actually holding on to these limitations. And I just want to encourage you to think about, what could our lives look like if we made progress in this area? What could life look like if we threw off these limitations, if we decided we were going to leave them behind, if we were able to live freely without these constraints? What could we achieve? What that dream that you've got deep down that maybe you never even like to voice to anyone, that you've never even entertained because you think you are limited by all these things. Maybe you could entertain it. Maybe you could achieve it. That life you dream of having, that person that you dream of one day becoming, maybe it could happen. If we stand firm in our freedom and stop holding on to the things that hold us back, who knows who we might become? Who knows also the wider impact that it would have if every single person who is listening today applies this and makes these kind of changes. The wider impact that we could have collectively could be huge. Not only would individuals' lives be changed for the better, not only would each and every one of us make progress to reaching our potential, but it would have such a positive effect on the world around us, on our relationships, on our community, maybe even on our society as a whole. Who knows what we could collectively achieve when we unlock our Christ-given freedom, when we rid ourselves of limitations, of the things that are holding us back, and step into our God-given potential. Because you are destined for greatness, for influence, for significance. It's not just for the 1% elite out there, it's for each and every one of us. But it only comes when we step into our freedom, our Christ-given freedom.